Hello, my name is Layla, and 5 months of my life, every spreadsheet, every late-night draft, every working weekend, was quietly stolen by my own sister. She called me dead weight behind my back, presented my project as hers, removed my name from every file, every slide. The worst part? No one noticed. Not my boss, not our parents, not even the people I worked with side by side. They all looked at her and saw brilliance. They looked at me and looked away. Until one morning, in front of the entire company, I stood up with nothing but a blank folder and 2 words: good luck. And what happened next is why you're still listening. What would you do if the person who betrayed you shared your blood and still smiled like nothing happened? Rain drummed steadily against the windows as I stepped into the conference room that morning. Everything outside was gray and damp, Seattle's usual March mood. Inside, the LED lights cast an even colder tone across the long glass table. I walked in early, as always, and took a seat near the far end. I liked the quiet. I liked preparing in silence. I pulled my laptop from my bag and opened the slide deck. Every slide had been polished to perfection the night before. I'd checked the transitions, color contrasts, even the position of the company logo. It was the culmination of nearly 5 months of late nights and quiet weekends, hours my colleagues never saw. I wasn't there to impress. I was there to deliver. But even then, I knew deep down, it wouldn't matter. People began to filter in, chatting softly, settling into their spots. Some offered nods in my direction. A few smiled. No one sat near me. It wasn't personal. It never was. I was just there. And then she arrived. Isolde breezed in like she always did, heels clacking with each confident step, phone in hand, Starbucks cup in the other. Her navy blazer hugged her frame just right, and her hair, as always, was effortlessly pinned back like she hadn't even tried. Except I knew better. Isolde didn't do anything without purpose. She didn't look at me when she entered. She didn't need to. Everyone else straightened up a little when she walked in. She moved like someone who had already won. And in most rooms like this one, she usually had. "Good morning, everyone," she said brightly, placing her cup on the head of the table. "Let's dive in. We've got exciting progress on the pilot project." I didn't say a word. The projector flickered to life as she connected her laptop. The title slide appeared. My title slide. Same font, same theme, same structure, except it had her name at the bottom. "This pilot," she began, "was developed under my direction. Layla," her voice paused ever so slightly, "helped coordinate some logistics." Some logistics. That was it. 5 months of planning, data cleaning, late-night modeling, vendor calls, timeline corrections, reduced to some logistics. I felt my stomach drop. I didn't speak. I didn't even blink. But something inside me shifted. No one corrected her. Not a single person in that room paused or questioned it. They nodded along, flipping through printed handouts I hadn't seen before. I wondered how many of my notes she had copied over. The meeting rolled forward like clockwork. Charts, projections, performance indexes. Her voice was smooth, practiced, polished, using my words in her cadence. I watched the scene unfold like a movie I'd already seen but couldn't skip. When it ended, people clapped. The VP smiled and told her, "Good work, Isolde." She gave a small, humble smile. "Just doing my part." As the others trickled out, I gathered my things slowly. I didn't trust my face. My hands moved steadily, but my pulse was high. I needed air. I needed space. I stepped into the hallway, heading for the elevator. That's when I heard her voice again. I paused, instinct more than anything, and listened. She stood near the coffee station with one of the senior managers, laughing softly. "Honestly," she said, sipping her latte, "Layla's a sweet girl, but she's a bit of dead weight sometimes." There was a pause. "She means well, of course," she added with a grin, "but you know how it is. Some people just follow better than they lead." The words were delivered so casually, so effortlessly, it took me a moment to register their weight. Dead weight. I froze, eyes locked on the elevator door ahead of me. I could see her reflection faintly in the polished steel, standing there, latte in hand, my project in her mouth, and now this. I didn't move. I didn't speak. Something in me hardened, not out of anger, not yet, but realization. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was personal, intentional. The elevator arrived. I didn't step in. Instead, I turned and walked back to my desk. I sat down slowly, the screensaver glowing on my monitor. The spreadsheets were still open, the ones I had built, line by line, formula by formula. I stared at the blinking cursor, my fingers hovering over the share button on the company server. I could have sent it all out. The clean version, the one with my watermark and timestamps. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I minimized the window and opened a new folder. I named it Contingency Plan, Phase 1. Then I opened a blank document and typed 4 words at the top. She doesn't know yet. I saved the file and leaned back in my chair. I didn't reply. I didn't scream. I just started planning. I didn't sleep that Friday night. The clock by my bed blinked past 2, then 3, and still my eyes stayed open. Not from rage, not even pain. What I felt was colder than that. Something like a quiet detachment, like I was watching my own life from the other side of a one-way mirror. Saturday afternoon passed in a blur. I went to the store, picked up a fruit tart, the one from the refrigerated shelf that looked decent enough to pass for homemade, and tried to convince myself this dinner didn't matter. It was just a routine meal, just a few hours with my parents and Isolde. Nothing would happen, nothing would change. By 6:30, I was pulling into the familiar driveway. The lights inside were already on, casting soft yellow glows through the curtains. I stepped out, tart in hand, and took a long breath before walking up to the door. Mom greeted me with her usual warmth, kissing my cheek like she hadn't seen me in years. "Oh, honey, I didn't know you'd make it tonight," she said, already turning toward the kitchen. She hadn't noticed the dessert. "I always come to Saturday dinner," I replied gently, setting the box on the counter. "Oh, right," she mumbled, moving a pan off the stove. "It's just that Isolde said you've been swamped lately. She mentioned you were overwhelmed." I didn't answer. I just washed my hands and found my usual seat, at the corner of the table, right next to the pantry door. The same spot I'd occupied since high school. Isolde arrived 5 minutes later, loud and shining like a brand new pendant in a Tiffany box. She kissed Mom on the cheek, ruffled Dad's hair like he was her old college buddy, and gave me a quick cursory glance before placing her purse on the bench. "Well, look at us," she said, unfolding her napkin. "The whole family, just like old times." Dad chuckled softly, eyes never leaving his newspaper. We passed dishes, made small talk about spring traffic, tulip season, and how Mom's friend Linda got scammed by someone pretending to be her grandson. It was almost comfortable, until the conversation drifted toward work. "So," Mom said brightly, "Isolde, your dad tells me that project you're heading is a big deal now?" Isolde smiled, modest and practiced. "Oh, the logistics pilot? Yeah, it's gaining traction. Took months of groundwork, a lot of long nights. You know how it is. But I finally got it to where it needs to be." She took a sip of water, then added, "Thankfully, I had the right team to execute my vision, though some parts required more caring than others." Her eyes didn't shift. She didn't have to look at me for everyone to know what she meant. I blinked. Not slowly, just once. Mom chuckled like it was a compliment. "Well, you've always been the leader, sweetie. Ever since you were bossing your sister around with those lemonade stands." I didn't speak. I felt my throat tighten, but not from tears. It was that familiar feeling, like I was disappearing in real time. Dad glanced up briefly, then back at his paper. I placed my fork down carefully, trying not to let the metal click too loud on the ceramic. After dinner, I retreated to the bathroom. The light flickered once before settling into its dull yellow glow. I sat on the closed toilet lid and pulled out my phone. A new internal memo had dropped. Final draft of the pilot report. I opened it. Lead author, Isolde C. Contributors, blank. No mention of my name. Not in the footnotes, not in the acknowledgements, not even a reference to data support. It was like I had never existed in that room, in those spreadsheets, in the all-nighters I pulled just to make her look good. I took a screenshot, then another, then downloaded the PDF and sent it to myself. I saved the file under a new folder. Confirmations. When I came out of the bathroom, Isolde was laughing with Dad about something to do with golf. Mom was already clearing dishes. No one noticed my absence. Or maybe they did, and chose not to say a word. I'm heading out, I said. Mom turned, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Already? I've got a few things to wrap up tonight, I answered. Isolde tilted her head. Still trying to catch up? She asked, a little too sweet. You know, sometimes it's okay to admit when you're out of your depth. My jaw didn't move. Thanks for the advice. Outside, the night had turned damp and breezy. I slid into the driver's seat and let the radio play softly as I pulled away from the curb. The windshield wipers cut across the glass in rhythmic swipes, but the noise did nothing to clear my head. The highway was mostly empty. My thoughts were not. This wasn't just about being overlooked anymore. This was a rewrite, a deliberate deletion. Isolde hadn't just taken the spotlight. She'd erased the proof I was ever even there. I turned off the music. This isn't just about credit, I whispered to the empty car. This is about erasure. My hands tightened around the wheel. At a red light, I opened the voice memos app on my phone, hit record, and spoke just one word into the silence. Phase 2. The weekend passed like wet cement, slow and weighty, dragging behind me, no matter how many errands I ran or closets I reorganized. By Sunday night, I'd made a detailed list of backup files to recover first thing Monday. I even laid out my blazer. I wanted to look composed, calm, not like someone who'd been pushed out of her own story. That Monday morning, the lobby at work smelled like burnt coffee and floor wax. Same as always. I nodded at the security guard, flashed my badge, and stepped into the elevator with 3 other employees making small talk about the weather. I didn't say anything. I was too focused on what I needed to confirm. By 8:03, I was at my desk. The hallway still buzzed with that early energy, clicks of heels, hums of microwaves reheating breakfast, fingers tapping on phones. I opened my laptop and sipped my coffee, ready to dive into the pilot project dashboard, the one I had built from the ground up. But when I clicked the shared folder icon, a message popped up. Access denied. I paused, stared at the screen, then refreshed. Still the same message. I opened a different document, my old draft of the timeline, and that opened just fine. But when I went back to the pilot project repository, I was locked out again. I checked the file path. It was the same one I'd used for months. Same server, same group. My permissions had been removed. On a Monday morning, without notice. At first, I told myself it was a mistake. It had to be. Maybe someone in IT had changed group access. Maybe a reset had triggered. I even smiled to myself, too tightly, and walked down the hall. IT was 3 doors down, past the break room. I found Greg at his desk, halfway through a protein bar, staring at 2 monitors filled with code and charts. Morning, I said lightly, trying not to sound too pointed. Hey, quick thing. I think I'm locked out of the pilot project files. Could be nothing, but would you mind checking? Greg gave me that polite tech guy shrug and typed something on his keyboard. Username? I gave it. He tapped for a few seconds, squinted, then turned slightly toward me. His tone changed. Huh. Yeah. Looks like your access was revoked Friday evening. Around 5:37 p.m., request came from Strategy. I didn't flinch, but inside, something in me went very still. Strategy department? I echoed. He nodded. Yup. Request was tagged to a senior account. No notes, just a role removal. I thanked him, turned, and walked out without a word. Not too fast, not too slow, just enough to keep the rhythm of someone who didn't want anyone to see the flicker in her chest. Back at my desk, I sat down, hands in my lap. I looked around. Everyone else was working like nothing had happened, because for them, nothing had. My team hadn't noticed. Why would they? To them, I was still helping. A ping sounded on my monitor. Calendar invite. Quarterly review, hosted by Isolde C. And there it was. The transfer was official. I clicked into the invite, checked the attendee list. Executives, team leads, department heads, and me. Still on the list. Still invited to the performance of a project I'd created, but apparently no longer owned. No explanation, no handover, no decency. I closed the window. I didn't cry. I didn't feel rage either, not the kind that explodes. What I felt was exact, like a thread finally pulled loose after being sewn too tight for too long. I opened a new folder on my desktop. Named it Reclamation Archive. Then I got to work. First, the raw data timelines, every export from the first week we started testing. Then the project scoping doc with my initial notes. I pulled audio memos from my phone, voice logs I'd made late at night to track model inconsistencies. I even found a napkin sketch I'd taken a picture of during one of our earlier brainstorms, before Isolde ever showed interest. Each item went into the folder. I labeled them with dates, specific tags, and descriptions. No vague labels, nothing ambiguous. I wasn't compiling a defense. I was preparing a record, something undeniable, something that would speak louder than I ever could in a meeting room full of practiced smiles. By mid-afternoon, I had enough material to tell the entire story of the project, beginning to end, without a single word from anyone else. I loaded it all onto an encrypted external drive and slipped it into the inside pocket of my bag. That evening, while most of the office was chatting near the elevators about dinner reservations, I stayed at my desk. Final check. File integrity. Format consistency. No loose ends. When I finally shut my laptop, the room had thinned out. I stood, smoothed my blazer, and zipped my bag slowly. They thought they could remove me. They thought that pulling access would erase me. But I built the blueprint. By the time I reached my car, the sun had already started to dip behind the buildings. Monday evenings in Seattle had a particular kind of melancholy, just gray enough to feel like the weekend had never happened, but not quite dark enough to forget the office lights. I drove home with the radio low, fingers tapping the steering wheel in rhythm with a jazz station I didn't normally listen to. I didn't go straight into the house. I sat in the driveway for a moment, letting the engine run. My bag was heavier than usual, though the only thing added was a single USB drive tucked between a snack wrapper and my backup phone charger. I looked at the porch light, thought of all the evenings I'd come home bone-tired from running that project, while Isolde had floated around doing stakeholder management. I walked in quietly, dropped my bag on the chair near the window, and turned on just the lamp in the corner. Then I kicked off my shoes, rolled up my sleeves, and pulled out my laptop. It was time. Earlier that day, the department had its weekly sync. Everyone was there. Well, everyone that mattered. Isolde had volunteered to present progress on the pilot. "Thought I'd walk us through where we are," she'd said, eyes sweeping the room like she was bestowing a gift. I'd taken a seat in the back, near the coffee urn. Not because I didn't want to be seen, but because I needed to observe. Every eye flicker, every reaction, every word. The deck she opened looked awfully familiar. Same layout, same slide order. I recognized the color palette because I'd customized it to match our brand colors and accessibility standards. Even the phrasing, optimizing vendor communication through real-time data adjustment, was straight from a memo I wrote at 1:42 a.m. 6 weeks ago. And there it was, out of her mouth. My sentence, my rhythm, my voice. She didn't even blink as she said it. I looked around the room. Nobody flinched. No one turned to look at me. Of course they didn't. To them, it sounded natural coming from her. She spoke with that crisp, performative clarity people mistake for leadership. The words were mine, but the delivery? All Isolde. Then, in the middle of explaining a performance slide, she paused. It wasn't long, barely half a second, but her eyes flicked toward me. Just a flash. I met her gaze. I didn't smile, I didn't scowl. I just held her there, and she looked away first. Back at home now, I opened a fresh document. No templates, no formatting, just a blank screen. I started listing every asset tied to the project, version dates, authorship tags, internal approval trails. Then I opened a folder from 3 months ago, voice memos I'd recorded while testing data filters. I copied them into a new folder. I dug out a stack of Post-it notes from my kitchen drawer, lined them up on the coffee table, each with a category: planning, drafts, client feedback, data testing, final edits. I began laying everything out like pieces to a puzzle, except I already knew what the picture was. I just needed to show them I'd drawn it first. It was almost midnight when I pulled out the external drive. Sleek, black, no label. I transferred everything into a master folder and named it Proof LC Archive. But then I opened another blank folder and titled it simply Good Luck. That one? It stayed empty. I stared at it for a while, then dragged it into the shared drive where Isolde had been uploading presentation files. I didn't delete anything. I didn't sabotage. I just gave her an early gift, one I knew she'd open too late. The truth is, I didn't want revenge. I wanted restoration. I wanted my work back in my own voice, not piped through hers like some stage script she never helped write. Some people yell when they've been wronged, others retreat. Me? I build timelines. I archive evidence. I wait for the right stage and the right light. I clicked save, leaned back on the couch, and looked at the quiet apartment around me. She could have had my help. She chose to steal instead. She wanted the spotlight. I was building the fuse. The morning air felt unusually crisp for mid-April. I opened the office door with one hand, balancing my coffee in the other. A familiar ding echoed as I passed the front desk. I didn't bother making small talk. I went straight to my corner desk, powered on my machine, and settled into the quiet routine that had once been my comfort, and now, my cover. Just as I began checking the system logs from the shared folder, my phone buzzed. I picked it up without much thought, expecting some internal notification. What I saw made my breath stop. A message. From Isolde. The little deadweight doesn't even know what's coming. This is going to be perfect. No context. No greeting. Just that. It took a second to register. The message wasn't meant for me. I stared at it for longer than I care to admit. The words weren't sharp. They were surgical, precise. I could see her smirking while she typed it, confident that she was in control of the narrative, that I was still asleep at the wheel. I didn't reply. I didn't show it to anyone. I simply whispered, "Good." Because the moment I read it, something inside clicked into alignment. That afternoon, when most of the team had left for their late lunch, I pulled up the project's shared folder directory. I kept my screen turned slightly away from the hallway, just in case. The archive I had compiled the week before, complete, detailed, time-stamped, was safe, stored offline, encrypted 3 ways. Untouchable. But the copy sitting in our central drive, the one Isolde had been presenting from, was something else entirely. Click by click, I removed every substantial file, every chart, every documented model test, every narrative brief. Gone. In their place, I uploaded a single PowerPoint, 36 slides, all blank. No title, no graphs, just one final slide with bold black text centered in the middle. Good luck. I named the folder exactly that. I checked the upload timestamp, then I cross-checked the permissions, just enough access for her to think nothing had changed. The trap was simple, clean, and silent. Afterward, I emptied my browser cache, closed everything, and stood from my desk with a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. That evening, back home, I changed into my comfiest sweatshirt, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat at the kitchen table with my notebook open. On the first page, I wrote, "You do not need to yell. Let the silence be your sword." Then I flipped the page and listed the date of the final stakeholder presentation. 1 week from today. I practiced my opening line in my head. Then again aloud. Soft, steady, deliberate. By the time I was halfway through the second glass of wine, I had run through the entire delivery twice. Not just the words. My breath, my stance, my tempo. I knew every place she would stumble. I knew every number she had memorized without context, every model she hadn't actually tested. I didn't need to raise my voice. The data would speak. The evidence would breathe for me. Before bed, I packed my work bag with precision. One fresh USB, my backup drive, a physical copy of the project report, printed, bound, time-stamped, and my blazer, pressed and waiting by the door. It wasn't arrogance. It was preparation. She was still playing a game of image. I was playing chess. The next morning, as I logged into my computer, a new meeting request popped up. I didn't have to read the whole thing to know what it was. The subject line said it all. Final stakeholder presentation, hosted by Strategy Department. I scanned the invite. All department heads would be there. Leadership, budget holders, people who had the power to decide what moved forward and who got left behind. I scrolled to the bottom of the recipient list. Isolde was listed as presenter. My name was nowhere. But it didn't matter. I clicked accept without hesitation. I didn't threaten her. I didn't even warn her. But I did leave her one message. When I arrived that morning, the building was unusually quiet for a presentation day. The kind of stillness that tells you something big is coming, but nobody's ready to talk about it. I walked past reception, nodded at the security guard, and took the elevator up without a word. On the ride to the 14th floor, I could feel the weight in my bag. USB drive, backup folder, handwritten cue cards. Like armor I'd spent months forging. I stepped into the executive conference room 20 minutes before showtime. The long table gleamed under overhead lights, chairs perfectly aligned, water glasses half filled as if someone had measured them. I chose a seat in the back corner, close enough to see the screen clearly, but far enough to watch the room unfold. The VP arrived first, greeting no one. He reviewed his notes with the intensity of someone grading a final exam. Then came the finance director, 2 supply chain leads, and the head of compliance. All of them quietly settled in, exchanging nods, but skipping the usual chit-chat. They knew today mattered. At 10:01 a.m., Isolde swept in. Hair sleek, blazer sharp, lips tinted like someone ready for a magazine shoot. She looked like she owned the air she breathed. And judging by the way some of the men straightened in their seats, she knew it. She didn't look at me, not once. "Good morning," she said brightly, plugging in her laptop. "Thanks for being here. I know your time is valuable, so let's jump in." The projector screen flickered as she clicked the remote. Then it stayed blank. She clicked again. Still nothing. She gave a tight smile and tapped a few keys. "Sorry, folks. Must be a brightness issue. These HDMI connections have minds of their own." No one laughed. A couple of people shifted in their chairs. She unplugged and replugged the cable. Clicked again. Nothing. The VP leaned back, fingers laced. "Should we give it a moment or—" Isolde chuckled softly. "Just a hiccup, 1 second." Another click, still blank. "Maybe the file didn't transfer properly," she said, her voice higher now. "Let me try from the cloud backup." The screen remained empty. And that's when I stood up. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. I rose like I was stretching after sitting too long. I reached into my bag, pulled out my drive, and walked slowly to the front of the room. Isolde froze. Her hand hovered over the trackpad. "I can help," I said evenly. "Would you like me to present the full version?" She blinked. A moment passed. Another. The room fell into complete silence. I didn't wait for her answer. I walked past her, calm and direct, unplugged her laptop, and plugged in my own. The screen lit up instantly. Title slide in crisp font. Company logo placed perfectly in the corner. AI-driven logistics pilot initiative, prepared by Layla C. No one said a word. The next slide appeared. Performance benchmarks, side-by-side comparisons, and my original model structure. Everything Isolde couldn't explain if she tried. I turned to face them all. VP, directors, legal, finance. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. Let's begin, I said. The first few minutes passed with only the hum of the projector and the occasional scribble of a pen. The room transformed as each slide advanced. Graphs, timelines, real-time process improvements, all supported by datasets no one else had touched. I explained how we modeled warehouse routes using AI-powered simulations, how we reduced delays by nearly 40% during peak season, how we flagged vendor miscommunication 2 weeks before the holiday crunch. At one point, someone asked a question about how we verified our historical data. I clicked into a hidden slide and showed the log history with full audit trails, timestamps, user access, data pulls, all under my name. And still, I never raised my voice. I didn't gloat. I let the facts work like gravity, steady, undeniable. Toward the end, I noticed her beside me. Isolde hadn't moved. Her jaw was tight. Her hands rested at her sides, fingers curling slightly, like they were trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. When I reached the final slide, I paused. The room was still. This project wasn't just about logistics, I said, eyes on the table. It was about building something solid, something that lasts even when the credits get shuffled. No one replied. But they didn't need to. The VP stood first. "Thank you, Layla," he said, his voice steady. "That was very thorough." A few others nodded. Someone whispered, "Impressive." I closed my laptop gently and unplugged the drive. The moment didn't need fireworks. It needed silence. And the first slide had spoken louder than I ever needed to. I hadn't even taken 2 steps away from the projector before a hand shot up near the end of the table. It was Graham Park, Director of Operations. Sharp suit, slower voice, the kind of man who lets silence do half his work for him. "I noticed the efficiency chart you shared earlier shows a 9% variance from what we received last Friday," he said, his tone even. "Can you explain the discrepancy?" I didn't flinch. "Of course," I replied, clicking back to the chart. The version submitted Friday evening was altered. The figures shown today are from the original model output, verified against internal logs and confirmed by testing reports. I can share the file access trail if you'd like. A few people exchanged glances. Graham leaned forward. "Altered by whom?" I glanced toward Isolde, still standing at the edge of the screen, arms rigid at her sides. "The edit trail points to a strategy department upload," I said, voice calm. "Time-stamped. Friday, 6:12 p.m. There was a short rustle of murmurs around the room. I watched their expressions shift. Not shock, but recognition. Like puzzle pieces clicking into place, they hadn't realized were scattered. Another hand went up. This time it was from Marisol, a VP from finance, who rarely spoke unless it was critical. "I just want clarity here," she said. "Who submitted the final presentation file for today?" Isolde cleared her throat. "That would be me," she said quickly. "But there may have been a file sync issue. Sometimes when we transfer—" "Did you personally write the updated performance sections?" Marisol interrupted, gently but firmly. There was a pause. Isolde blinked. "I compiled it from the team's shared documents. I was under the impression—" "Did you write the machine learning script?" someone else asked from the far side of the room. It was Leon, lead engineer, whose only loyalty was clean code. Isolde's jaw tightened. The final model was a collaborative effort. "It was written in Python 3.8, I said evenly, with integrated calls to our legacy system using a hybrid transformer-based model. I can share the Git commit logs and script files right now if needed. I reached into my bag, pulled out a second USB, and held it up. The VP, who had remained quiet, finally leaned forward. He steepled his fingers, gaze flicking between us. "I believe we're seeing two very different pictures here," he said slowly. The air in the room changed. It wasn't loud. It was sharper, focused. Isolde's hands were clenched so tightly that the knuckles had turned pale. She said nothing. Next to the door, Jolene shifted in her seat. Her eyes met mine. She didn't nod, didn't smile, just watched. But I saw something in her face that I hadn't seen in months. Relief. The screen remained paused on my slide. It wasn't fancy, just clean lines, clean logic, clean evidence. And it was enough. The VP turned to Isolde again. "Do you have the original version you built yourself?" he asked. She opened her mouth, closed it, and didn't speak. I felt no triumph, only the settling of something long displaced. She had spent weeks rehearsing a script that wasn't hers. And now the lights were up, and the cue cards had vanished. She stood frozen. Her fingers twitched at her sides. Her breath grew shallow. Everyone watched, waiting for something. An explanation, an excuse, even a breakdown. None came. Instead, silence filled the space she used to dominate. I didn't look away. I didn't pity her. But I didn't gloat either. Because this wasn't about humiliation. It was about truth reasserting itself. The truth had been patient, methodical. It had worn heels and makeup and charm. But when the numbers spoke, when the logs clicked open, truth stopped needing to dress up. And she wasn't just caught. She was undone by her own silence. The door clicked softly behind her as she left the room, papers tucked against her chest, like they might protect her from something no document ever could. No one followed, no one spoke. It was the quietest adjournment I'd ever witnessed, and somehow it still felt loud. The VP stood, adjusted his blazer, and nodded once in my direction before walking out with the others. Chairs scraped gently across the polished floor, heels tapped in retreat, and just like that, the room emptied. Only Jolene lingered. She didn't approach me. She simply walked by, slow and steady, her shoulder passing within inches of mine. As she passed, she murmured, "You didn't just win. You reminded us what integrity looks like." I turned to glance at her, but she was already out the door. I stayed behind for another 5 minutes. Let the silence stretch. Let the air clear. I needed the stillness, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was finally calm. By the time I stepped out into the hallway, the building was already shifting back into its afternoon rhythm. Emails pinging, elevators humming, conversations picking back up. But none of it touched me. Not today. I made it back to my desk and collected my things in silence. Laptop, charger, that same USB I'd carried like a weapon all week. The walk to the parking garage was familiar. Familiar but different. My shoes echoed a little louder. My shoulders felt looser. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to brace for whatever came next. Traffic was light. I drove with the window cracked, letting in just enough wind to remind me I was still moving. By the time I reached my apartment, the sky had softened into a dull lavender, clouds shifting like slow exhalations across the city. I slipped off my shoes at the door and made a cup of tea. Chamomile, nothing fancy. Just warm and quiet. Then I opened my laptop and checked my inbox. One new message. Subject, transition, no greeting, no closing line. Effective immediately, I'm stepping away from my current responsibilities. Thank you for your support. Please direct all project-related communication to Layla C. That was it. No name, no apology, no explanation. I read it once, then again, then a third time, just to be sure. And then I deleted it. No screenshot, no forwarding, no saving. She had removed herself, and for once, I didn't feel the need to mark the moment. I left my laptop open and moved to the window. The tea had cooled slightly by the time I took my first sip. Outside, The street was quiet. A dog barked 2 blocks away. Someone's wind chime rang twice in the breeze. I wasn't smiling, but I wasn't grinding my teeth either. For the first time in weeks, maybe longer, I wasn't chasing visibility. I was simply present, solid, real. There was nothing left to fight for, no spotlight to reclaim. The truth had done its work. She disappeared without a goodbye. But I wasn't waiting for one. Later that same week, on a quiet Wednesday evening, my phone buzzed softly on the kitchen counter while I was rinsing out a mug. I didn't rush to check it. There was no longer any urgency to notifications, no instinct to brace for more damage. But when I finally wiped my hands and picked it up, the name on the screen stopped me cold. Dad. It was a simple message. No greeting, no emojis, just 12 words. You were always the one holding the structure. We just didn't see it. Proud of you. I stared at it until the screen dimmed. Then I tapped it back awake just to read it again. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it didn't need to be. He wasn't the type to say, "I'm sorry." He was the type to say nothing, or worse, to say something dismissive. And yet here it was, a quiet recognition. In his way, it was the loudest thing he'd ever said to me. I didn't reply. Not right away. I just stood there in my kitchen, barefoot, tea cooling on the counter behind me, and let it settle into my chest like something long overdue. The next morning, I arrived at the office to find a company newsletter folded neatly on my desk. We still received a print version, mostly out of tradition. Usually, it gathered dust in break rooms or got tossed beside the copier. But this one had my name on the cover. Logistics Initiative leads Q2 Strategy Push. Vision by Layla C. I blinked. Read it again. Below the headline was a photo of the slide I had presented. My design, my data, my layout. And right beneath it, in clear font, lead architect, Layla C. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt real. No one congratulated me in person that day. No standing ovation. But I noticed subtle shifts. People who hadn't looked me in the eye for weeks now greeted me in the hallway. Emails came without per Isolde's request. And when I walked into the kitchen for coffee, someone had moved my favorite mug to the front of the cabinet. Later that afternoon, I returned from a meeting to find a plain envelope resting on my chair. No handwriting on the outside. I opened it slowly, expecting perhaps a memo or an anonymous complaint, because when you're a woman who wins without smiling, people like to assume you've cheated. But inside was a single note, handwritten, slightly shaky, probably rushed. We knew, we saw. Some of us were just afraid. You showed us how to stand. No signature, no sender. I folded it carefully, pressed the crease flat, and slid it under the base of my monitor. Not as a trophy, as a reminder that not everyone is brave the first time, but sometimes one act of clarity can make the next easier. 2 weeks after Isolde's exit, I was called to present Phase 2 of the project to the executive board. I walked into that same boardroom where everything had once slipped away from me. Only this time, people looked up. And then, one by one, they stood. Not because of protocol, not out of pity, but because they knew. They knew who had built the foundation, who had endured, who had stayed steady while someone else played with the paint. I stood at the head of the room, not as an assistant, not as a silent worker behind the curtain, but as the rightful lead. I clicked the remote. The screen lit up. Next phase implementation, National Rollout Plan, lead, Layla C. My voice didn't tremble. I didn't rush. This model works, I said, pointing to the diagram on the screen. But it only works when we acknowledge every builder, every contributor, every hour no one sees. Heads nodded. Pens moved. No one interrupted. I continued, outlining the logistics chain, the real-time feedback loop, and predictive capacity for peak demand seasons. And when I finished, there were no lingering doubts, no sideways glances. Only space. Space I had cleared myself. I didn't just reclaim what was mine. I rewrote where I belong. Sometimes the most powerful statement isn't made with shouting or confrontation, but with proof, patience, and timing. Layla's story reminds us that being underestimated doesn't mean being powerless. And sometimes, the quiet ones build the loudest legacies. Have you ever had someone take credit for your work or silence your contribution completely? What did you do or wish you had? If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. There's more to come: real stories, real voices, and the quiet strength behind them.